My name is Jeffrey Katz, and I'm the president of the Washington Map Society. It's a special honor and privilege to welcome you to tonight's program with Matthew Edney, to whom we all owe a debt of gratitude for directing the University of Wisconsin's History of Cartography project. As many of you know, the series of lectures of which this program is a part is sponsored virtually by a partnership of 7 map societies representing all parts of the country. The California Map Society, thank you, Amy, Chicago, New York, Philip Lee Phillips, Rocky Mountain, Texas, and the Washington Map Society. All of these societies are nonprofit organizations that support map collecting, cartography, and the study of cartographic history. And if you're not a member, we hope you'll consider joining at least one and maybe more. The benefits for each society vary. For example, members of the Washington Map Society receive 3 annual issues of the Portland, our journal, digital access to all past issues of the Portland, and digital access to past guest speaker lectures, and many other features, including in the members only section, including a directory of members. If you are not a member of the Washington Map Society, we have an introductory rate of $25 for the first year of digital membership. I'd also like to thank our advertisers who support all of our groups and help make possible the publication of our journals. The Portland and Calafia, the Journal of the California Map Society in particular. Before we proceed further with tonight's program, a couple of housekeeping items. Please note that the lecture will be recorded. So please turn off your video and microphone if for some reason you don't want to be recorded, and please use the chat feature to type questions, and they'll be addressed at the conclusion of the talk. So let me now turn the program over to Ron Grimm, our Vice President for Programs at the Washington Map Society, to give you a peek at our upcoming programs and to introduce our speaker. So over to you, Ron.
Okay. In consultation with the other map societies, we are developing a schedule of monthly Zoom and in-person meetings through April 2025. Program schedule, which will be published in the next issue of the Portland. The next issue is in progress and of layout and design under the direction of our new editor, Andrew Adamson. I want to bring to your attention the next 2 program events on the Washington Map Society schedule, one in person only and the other virtual. The first is scheduled for Thursday evening, November 21st, and is entitled Library of Congress 25th Annual GIS Day, Mapping Our World. Presented as one of the Library of Congress Live at the Library Series, this event will feature Dr. Vicki Ferrini from Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, talking about ocean floor mapping, along with a display of related collection items. This in-person event will be held in the Library of Congress Jefferson Building, LJ 119, starting at 6:30 p.m. The next virtual event is scheduled for Wednesday, December 7, starting at 7:00 p.m. Eastern Time. The speakers will be Dr. Neil Ashbury, rare map collector, CEO of Legacy Companies, and host of syndicated weekly radio talk show, Neil Asbury's Made in America, and Dr. Jean-Pierre Isbou, a historian and professor emeritus, Fielding Graduate University. The title of their presentation will be Mapping the Holy Land, an illustrated discussion. Using a wide range of maps, rarely seen prints, illustrations, and documentation of one of the most mapped locations in the world, they will discuss how understanding 2,000 years of the area's evolution is crucial to ever establishing peace in the region and the ways each faith and era throughout history used the canvas of mapping the Holy Land to express its unique ideas. Their recently published book, Mapping the Holy Land, an Illustrated Atlas, is available wherever books are sold. And now it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Matthew Edney, Osher Professor in the History of Cartography at the University of Southern Maine and Director of the History of Cartography Project at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He will provide an update on Volume 5 pertaining to the 19th century of the History of Cartography Project. This will be the final volume in this monumental reference work. The title of his presentation tonight is What's Different About Map Making in the 19th Century, and therefore in Volume 5 of the History of Cartography. I now turn the program over to Matthew. He will address a few of your questions at the conclusion of his presentation. You may type your questions in the chat feature during or after the presentation. Matthew, I turn the program over to you.
Great, thank you, Ron. Let me just start by, if you end your share, please, Ron, I'll start mine. There we go. And where's my... Okay, I've got too many files open. It's not showing me what I want. There we go. That's what I want. Good. So greetings. Thank you to the Washington Map Society for adding to me to this lecture series, and especially Ron for being so willing. It's been about 5 years, I think, since I last gave an update to any Map Society about the History of Cartography series, which is when I spoke in person at the New York Public Library to the New York Map Society back in May of 2019. So it's definitely time to bring you all up to date. And so my purpose is simply to give you a taste of some of the things you can expect in cartography in the 19th century, which is to say Volume 5 of the History of Cartography. It's getting very close to editorial completion. It is very large. So what I'm going to give you is my take, my slice through the volume, as it were. And I just want to be clear that if you ask anybody else involved, especially Roger Kane, the volume editor, what they think should be the key points to stress, they will have something completely different. So this is very much a personal assessment of a volume that I've had the pleasure to help create, but most of the work is done by other people for this volume. Throughout, I've tried to use examples from different authors and taken from a wide variety of institutions. So you should have a nice variety of imagery. And then I'll conclude with some comments about our anticipated schedule. So, it's going to be one of those days. Okay. For those of you who don't know the series, and I hope that everybody does, but I'll still reiterate it, just give you a quick introduction and orientation. So the History of Cartography is this massive award-winning series of 6 volumes in 12 bindings that Brian Harley and David Woodward founded more years ago than we can imagine, I can remember. Brian died in late 1991, David in 2004, and I took over from David as director of the project in 2005. We're based at the University of Wisconsin in the geography department, where all the fun work happens. Even though I'm in Maine, they're all over in Wisconsin. I'll come back to that at the end. So again, the goal of the History of Cartography series is to tell the history of maps and mapping as a necessarily human endeavor. across all parts of the world in all periods, intertwined with art and science, politics and literature, technology and culture. These volumes have been crucial in building up map historical studies over the last 50 years. It's a huge topic, and the series has been in preparation for a long time. So its publication history is inevitably complex. So one of the things that still has to be done for volume 5 is going to be my final conclusion. I'm going to try to wrap up the entire series in a short piece, which will get into some of the reasons for the weird publication history, among other things. So something to look forward to, perhaps. And this just leaves then volume 5. We've got what from volume 1 in 1987 to volume 4 in 2019 via volume 6 in 2015. Yeah, long story. We just have volume 5 to go, and it's almost there. Now, I should also say, if you don't know, that I was able to persuade our publisher, the University of Chicago Press, to put the older volumes online for free public access. Since the first volumes went online in 2011, we've had well over, I think we're around 5.5 million accesses and downloads and stuff. It's been very, very successful. The last volume to be published, volume 4, went online in July of last year, 2023. And volume 5 will go online about 3 years after print publication. So July 2030, we'll see. Now, volume 5 has the unfortunate position, sort of squeezed between two existing volumes, volume 4 on Enlightenment that I and Mary Pedley edited, and volume 6 on the 20th century that Mark Mominier edited. And so inevitably, volume 5 entails a very large degree of continuity as one passes from the 18th century into the 20th. That's absolutely unavoidable. So, for example, in the arena of thematic mapping, is absolutely undoubtedly clear that thematic mapping is one of the most active and innovative arenas of 19th century cartography, being fueled by a series of institutions, state and academic, and private for that matter, that are seeking information about physical environment, social conditions, and trying to communicate that in various ways. And I just love this. One sheet from the official Italian Geological Survey showing Mount Etna in the lower left of the map on Sicily. And you can see the lava flows and all the rest. So this kind of work is crucial in the 19th century, and you're going to find a lot of it throughout volume 5. This volume is going to be in the essay on administrative mapping in Italy by Maria Serrani. We also have plenty of thematic maps dealing with social phenomena. In this case, a famous map published by the US Coast Survey, or prepared by the Coast Survey from census data, showing the extent of slave populations in the American South based on the 1860 census. Fundamentally important map. It was Abraham Lincoln's, I don't know if it's his favoriteest map, but he certainly had a copy and ensured a copy was painted in that famous painting of the cabinet of rivals of Lincoln and his cabinet. So thematic mapping going all the way through volume 5. On the other hand, though, you have to admit that thematic mapping has origins in both the concept and some of the institutions, and also some of the cartographic strategies used to make thematic maps, starting in the 18th century. And so there is in volume 4 a fairly substantial chapter on a set of essays on thematic mapping in the 18th century. For example, showing Cassini's map of the extent of a solar eclipse in 1699. And again, in 20th century, there are lots of thematic maps in volume 6, such as the wonderful, very famous map using so-called Chernoff faces, where you modify different aspects to show a multivariate set of data, in this case, quality of life in Los Angeles from 1977. So we have these things. So, is important to volume 5, but it's not new to volume 5. It is not creating something. Thematic mapping is not something that's created in the 19th century. So I'm not going to talk much more about it in that way. In fact, the same kind of same kind of argument can be made for most all kinds of mapping coming out of the 18th century, going into through the 19th into the 20th, whether you're dealing with systematic topographic surveys, the classic ordnance survey here on your left. This is from Richard's private collection of early maps by the Ordnance Survey, or world and geographical mapping. Both of which developed in really interesting ways over the course of the 19th century. The one on the right, for example, is a great example of how Western mapping practices were either imposed or adopted by non-Western peoples, non-Western cultures, in this case, in a Khmer language publication. And that's really, really a key theme running through volume 5. But again, it's still not completely unique to volume 5, given that volume 4, we talked about Ottoman adoption of European mapping practices, and we have the same issues in volume 6. And just because, this really is an important theme in volume 5, it has to be there. Here are a couple more maps, a Chinese on the left and a Japanese map on the right. Showing European style sea charting, but in local scripts for local use. Probably derived from, as the long title for the Japanese one says, from European sources or American sources, but nonetheless being turned into objects of local consumption. But there are 3 areas, as far as I think, that I'm interested in particular, that are new to the 19th century, and where the 19th century broke new ground and require new kinds of content in volume 5. This is stuff that you don't get in 4 because it's new to 5, and at the same time, by the time you get into 6, it's become so subsumed and incorporated into most every other mapping practice that is not as significant in volume 6. So there are 3 things in volume 5 that really deserve to be isolated and set apart. And they're the very idea of cartography, colonial cartography, colonial mapping, and then the third one is railroad mapping. I just want to go through some of these instances, some examples of each of these novelties through the 19th century. So starting off with straight cartography. So the word cartography itself is a wonderfully complex word, depending on what you mean by cart, what you mean by graphy in particular. It was actually first coined by a guy who went by the name of Tessier in a manuscript report he wrote in about 1790 about his catalog that he'd been creating for the French Foreign Ministry of all the maps from the D'Anville collection the ministry had acquired in 1782. It's in a manuscript. It occurs one time only. No reason for it to catch on at all. Then in Paris in 1808, the Danish political refugee and geographer Conrad Maltbrun wrote and coined the word chartography with an H, chartography, in response to a proposal from Weimar by Friedrich Justin Berthook to make a 204-sheet map of Germany. And I should stress that the way this map was going to be created was to take a large number of existing or recently done topographic surveys of all the various states within the German Empire and combine them together within the geographical framework of latitude and longitude to make this very much larger systematic survey, systematic map, I should say, not a systematic survey. And this map, Maltbrun wrote, would be at a scale large enough to contain all the interesting details of topography and would therefore meet the desideratum of a detailed map that is useful not only to geographers and travelers, but also to the constituted authorities, governments, and especially to the military. And so he wrote, pardon me, this proposed map series would fill a lack in cartography. But again, this usage did not catch on. It's in one little journal and it disappears. Maltbrun later, in later 1820s, began to use cartography, again, still in French in Paris, rather facetiously. It was sort of mocking. He kept calling people cartographers who are sort of trying to maybe be a bit too pretentious in their work. Anyway, but he used it to refer to the entire interrelated endeavor of surveying and mapping that's just cohering at this point. It's picked up pretty quickly by German geographers. And as early as 1834, the German emigre to the USA uses it in America, Franz Lieber. He's writing, he's been hired to create a curriculum for a new school for the blind, sorry, for the deaf. And one of the kinds of drawing that he says needed to be taught is the drawing of maps or chartography. At least I believe we might use this word, formed after the French cartography, which comprises the drawing of geographical and topographical maps and charts and all the drawing of mensuration. So all the kinds of mapping that can be based on surveys and then can be generalized down from those surveys into regional maps. And it very much captures the word cartography in this creation, captures this sense that's absolutely new in the 19th century, early 19th century, that all regional maps, even world maps, should be based on extensive territorial surveys. So my favorite example of expression of this new sentiment is by J.R. Jackson, who was a British artillery officer who actually spent most of his career either in India or working for the Russian General Staff before he retired back to London. But in an essay on chartography in 1852, and talking about these new processes of mapping, surveying and mapping, he said, thus the interior of South America, though to the eye well filled in upon the general map, offers but a distant approximation to truth. And when in after years the axe shall have cleared the secular forests of that portion of the New World, very 19th century, and the vast regions that extend from the Andes to the Atlantic shall be covered with the abundant harvests and the habitations of a dense population, the territorial maps of the country then constructed will, upon a comparison with those now existing, show our descendants how wide of the truth were our general maps in the position of many places, and how totally different the true course of his rivers from what we now figure them with such show of accuracy. And in fact, this sort of aspirational idea of cartography continues and reaches, in some degrees, its apex in the 1890s with proposals to make a universal map of the world at a scale of 1 to 1 million. So that's all brand new. The second thing that's brand new in the 19th century is, well, not necessarily brand new, but it's colonial mapping. And of course, there were colonial mappings in the Enlightenment, and on the screen is one from volume 4. But with each colony in the 18th century being pretty distinct, there really was little coherence across all the different kinds of colonial and imperial mapping. And so there is actually in volume 4 no entry on colonial cartography or even on imperial cartography. There's just the themes that permeate that volume. But in volume 5, they're so important to the growth of the European empires that colonial mapping has to be brought out, not only in individual essays, but into a set of essays under the broad heading of colonial cartography. The reason for this is a significant shift in imperialism and the practices of European imperialism after about 1800. This is Aaron Arrowsmith's great big 1790 map of the world on Mercator's projection. And it's very useful because it allows us to show how before 1800, most European territorial expansion outside Europe had been in the Americas, and then mostly coastal. Enabled by decline of native populations through disease, through enforced slavery, through warfare. Europeans took over large swaths of territory. In the old world, where regions are far more populous and far more disease resistant, before 1800, the only real territorial expansion was by the British in parts of South Asia. But after 1790, 1800, this just changes. And the British, well, the British and the French, and to some degree the Germans, Spanish, Italians, all get involved in trying to dominate territorially and economically the area within those purple lines. There's a dramatic growth in territorial control in British India, territorial control in the Dutch East Indies, especially after the end of the VOC in 1799. As we know, later in the 19th century, the scramble for Africa, which comes to a head in the Treaty of Berlin of 1885, everybody's trying to get from the coast of Africa, where they've been trading for slaves, in particular through the 18th century. Now they're trying to get in the interior to access the land, its resources. And to some degree culminating in the quest, as you're moving east, to subdue China by the end of the 19th century. So throughout the 19th century, there's this fundamentally extensive effort to map all sorts of colonies by the different European powers, so that they can help be occupied and have their resources extracted. And there's several kinds of maps. You know, there's the basic kind of map of a colonial territory that's printed in a metropolitan state, in this case, in Lisbon in Portugal, allowing people in Europe to comprehend the distant colonies and so sort of think they know them and think they can make rules and laws about them from afar. There's also a whole bunch of colonial mapping that is much more precise, and really about very particular planning, again, from afar. This is a printed map, a couple of colors, lithographically printed in London, but it was never sold on the open market. This was printed for distribution within the colonial office in order to help plan, and in this case with his overprinting, to propose the placement of coastal artillery batteries and submarine mines, which are in the, you can see my mouse, they're the two lines of the submarine mines being proposed that would together help defend the British port on St. Lucia in the Caribbean. Something that in the 18th century would undoubtedly have been done in manuscript. By later 19th century, they can do these very cheaply and lithographically, so everybody involved in the planning, both locally and back in Europe, can have a copy. And then you have all the mapping made on site for exploitation of particular places. This is I mean, it's a stereotypical, it's the type of the map to be done for revenue surveys, land taxation in northwestern India. Unsettled means not unpopulated. It means the taxes haven't been settled. So the British have to go in and figure out what the taxation system is going to be. And as part of that, you make revenue surveys, very, very detailed plans of villages. So all this kind of mapping is just writ large through the 19th century to the point where it needs to have its own separate special consideration, as well as being distributed throughout other parts of the volume. And then the third big new stuff is new because railroads are only created in the 19th century. I mean, yes, there have been trackways since the 17th century used with horse-drawn carriages or carts, or even human-drawn carts to ship, to haul minerals, coal in particular, from a mine to a nearby navigable waterway. But it's with the introduction of small steam engines, especially after 1830, that the modern phenomenon of the railroad really takes off. Initially very small, again, just replicating the old trackways or supplying the urban need for suburban growth, the new suburbanites to come back into the city on a routine basis. For me, what really fascinating about the railroad mapping is the complete reorganization of places and spaces, both within and around cities. So here's a Belgian example of how trolley cars are going to be built and connect into this large area that's shown in green in this detail, which will be the new location for the new Gare du Midi in Brussels, where you can get a train to Amsterdam nowadays. I did it the other year. And then it's a complete reorganization of space, of cities themselves. And you have these maps, especially in these popular maps associated with timetables and guidebooks, where they really downplay the political boundaries. The state boundaries in this image are definitely not very prominent. There are no county boundaries, but rather what you have are strings of cities stretched out like pearls on necklaces, reaching out across the continent, in this case, the catchment area of this particular railroad. It's a completely different way of thinking about space, in which completely reduces the importance of political units in order to talk about economic units and economic connectivity and demographic connectivity and stuff. And in this line, I just got to show you one of my favorite. Oh no, before I get there. And the other thing about railroads is that they are absolutely crucial to this whole old world expansion, and also in America for that matter, of the new imperial system. We always like to talk about the 19th century empires as being maritime empires, that they stay maritime right up until 1930s and the introduction of long distance airplane travel. But really, it's much better to talk about those 19th century empires as empires of steam, steamships and steam trains. And when you start to see the complex networks of railways that the imperial powers built across India and into China, into Brazil, across the United States, that you really get to understand why the train is such an important symbol of 19th century idealizations of progress and the future, and the maps are part of that. And in that line, I just got to almost end this very quick review with a map that's not actually in the volume. I'm thinking of it. I haven't gone through the last part of my some of my essays yet. I haven't gone through the last round with them. They're late in the spring. So maybe I'll add this one in if I can. This is the famous Man of Commerce. Only 3 or 4 copies that have been catalogued. And it's just wonderful. And it just talks very clearly about this integration of steam powered shipping and steam powered transportation on land, as there's also this larger conceit of America, United States has grown up, its economic networks, its whole trade systems have grown up and developed along with the country, so that you have this incredible metaphor of an atomicized man reaching from Europe across all the way across the continent and then reaching out into the Pacific, starting the eventual American incursion into the Pacific was going to happen. So these then are three broad topics that I think are particularly unique to Volume 5. In addition to everything else, Volume 5 is so big, there's no way you can really summarize it. It's just too large, like all the volumes. How big is it? Well, it's going to be about 1 million words. That's our contracted limit with the press. And if you compare it with the volumes on either side, it's got a fair number of contributors, just shy of 200 contributors. A bit less than Volume 4, a lot less than Volume 6. We learned a lot from Mark's mum and his experience editing Volume 6. The contributors come from 33 countries. And Volume 6 is heavily US, UK oriented. That's in 20th century is very much the American century of cartography. Volume 4 has it's really a European focused volume, and so it's mostly European scholars, a few North American. But Volume 5 has a much larger number of countries represented, because it's not only American and British and the standard French and Germans and so on, but it's a lot more of some Chinese scholars and Japanese scholars, as I pointed out in some of these slides. Quite a few South American scholars as well. So very much broadening the scope of the authorial contributions in order to cover the greater scope of Volume 5. Smaller number of entries, because frankly, Roger Kane wanted to keep it manageable, which I understand. So smaller, but fewer numbers, but larger overall entries. About the same number of images, just over 1,000 full color images running through the whole volume, which would be really cool. And it's going to appear about the same size as Volume 4 and 6, about 1,900 pages, which is huge. Who all is doing this? Well, here's the team. If you've never seen the team, here they are. It's a bit of an old picture, so there are a couple of people here who are no longer with the project because they graduated and moved on. This is Jude Limer, who's the managing editor. She has read every word diligently of every volume since Volume 1. She joined the project in 1981. And this is her last thing. So it's great she's been with the project her entire career. This is Lindsay Boucher, senior research editor, who's worked only on Volume 5. We hired her to work on Volume 5 when Jude was stuck on Volume 4, so 5 didn't get too delayed. Tanya Kolarik is the last remaining graduate student. We used to have 3. The other ones are in this picture, but she's the last one. She's going to be graduating with a PhD in May, and so that she'll be the last graduate student, because we're going to be downsizing the overall staff. Dana Freiberger, I mean, he graduated with his PhD a year last May, 18 months ago, but he's with the project for so long, he's always there. I mean, skipping over Jen Singh Mehta down at the bottom, because she also graduated and moved on to good things. it's great when students get PhDs and move on. It's wonderful. This is Beth Freundlich, my project manager, without whom I would be sunk. She's my right-hand person in Madison, does all the heavy lifting of all sorts of things. Kathy Debevec, our financial specialist, actually on like a second retirement, I think. We have Amy Hendricks down at the bottom, who is a former PA who we've been hiring as an hourly for a while. And right at the back, last but not least, we have Roger Kane, who's the volume editor, and Roz Woodward, David's widow, and basically project mother and all-round supporter and wonderful person. So this is the team that has moved Volume 5 forward to the point where we are actually going to be submitting the manuscript, the entire 1,000,000 words of text, 1,054 images, all the permissions to reproduce those images, which amazingly we already have in hand. Normally that's a last-minute scramble on previous volumes. And we're going to submit everything, take it down to the press, we'll actually press a button and transmit it in 1st, 2nd, 3rd of July of 2025, which is 6 months before where we thought it would be, even last spring, spring of 24. We were still thinking we'd be delivering in December of 25, but it's going to be July 25, thanks to the hard work of everybody in the Madison office. And once it goes to press, we'll start reducing our staff because we don't need quite everybody, and that's one in hand. But we're going to be reviewing every stage of the press's work as they turn that huge manuscript and all the image files into a single polished 1,900-page book into bindings. And that's going to entail copy editing. And I assure you, the quickest way to go insane is to try to copy edit a 1,000,000-word essay. It's just, So we'll be doing it carefully, and we review what the press does, and then everything's fine. When everything is, well, then each batch, probably 6 batches all the way through, each batch is copy edited, go to Getty pages to lay out the text. It's a bit old-fashioned, but for a book this size, you've got to do it. They also do the color proofs to make quite sure when the images are printed in color, they'll look proper. And then when that's all done, we go to page proofs, where you actually lay out text and images all together. As the page proofs are completed, they go to the indexer. And eventually, when everything is done, they send the whole thing off to a printer and they print. Yay. And they also turn the digital files and make it an ebook, which you can also get. And it all should be printed and available in July 2027. Seems a long way off, but oh Lord, it can't come soon enough. We're getting there. We're really getting there, and it's going to be wonderful. And I should say also, you'll notice I haven't had any jacket designs for Volume 5 yet because we haven't finished them. We know one, but we don't know what the other ones are going to be yet. So we'll have that figured out sometime, probably this time next year, I think, at the latest. So having said all this, now I've got to do the serious note. Now I've captured you all. And that is this. Because all the work we have left to do is absolutely essential to maintain the quality of the work as it goes through all the stages and the manipulations that the press have to put it through, is essential, but it no longer counts as, quote, research in the eyes of our long-term federal funders, National Endowment for Humanities and the National Science Foundation, who have supported us for many years, but are no longer able to do so. It doesn't meet their criteria, what is left to be done. And we've had a lot of very good support from UW administration, from the college, from the Vice Chancellor for Research's office, and even from the Geography Department, which has been great. But it's been nowhere near a complete covering of the shortfall that we're facing. In fact, no, even our federal funders have never been able to fund the entire operations all at one go. We've always had to rely on a bit of UW money and a lot of private money. Last year, I was able to raise almost $200,000 in pledges from a few incredibly wonderful individuals who I am thoroughly indebted to. But having said that, we still anticipate a significant deficit that needs to be filled before we can finish. And if we don't have the money, everything will just drag to slow down to do the work with the money that we have in hand. So this fall, in addition to a whole bunch of other things that we're doing, I'm hoping that we can double our usual fall fundraising campaign, which normally brings in $40,000 to $50,000 a year from a large number of friends. And if you're one of those, you'll be getting the annual newsletter in a few weeks, which will have the information about giving and stuff. But I'm hoping to increase that to 100,000 for this year, or even in pledges for gifts for the next couple of years, so that we can plan. We know we've got the money coming in, so we can make the planning as we go through the last stages of work. So my request to everybody who is here is to think and try and maybe give to the project to show the University of Wisconsin that it is necessary to keep supporting us, and to thank the individuals who've given so substantially over the last year, and to think about giving. If you've given in the past, please consider giving more. If you've given $25 a year, maybe give $100. If you've given a wonderful $1,000, maybe $2,500, whatever. The more now, the easier it will be to finish the whole thing on time. And if you've never given to the project and you want a tax deduction, at least for US taxes, please consider doing so now. How do you do this, I hear you ask? Any gifts made or pledged by the end of February of next year will be included in the volume 5 printed acknowledgement. We have 3 or 4 pages at the front of every volume acknowledging donors. How do you do this? Well, there are several ways you can do it. One way is to go to supportuw.org/give-to/hiscart. This is the UW Foundation, the 501c3. So you can give to them as tax deductible. Or go to our website, which you can find very, very easily by Googling History of Cartography, Wisconsin. And up pops geography.wis.edu/hiscart. And then there's a big blue button, make a gift. Click on that, life is fine. You also find instructions on how to give by phone or by mail, and all sorts of other information. Or if you are interested and want to do something really interesting and want to talk to me about it, feel free to email me at edney@wisc.edu. So I'm going to say thank you both for listening and thank you for, I hope, giving and helping us see through this incredible, amazing, and wonderful project by completing this incredible, amazing, and wonderful volume. Thank you. I'm going to leave this up for a few minutes, if that's possible.
Thank you, Matthew. I think it's probably good if you leave that up for a bit, because I think there are some questions in that regard. And there seem to be a good many questions here, so just give me a minute.
Oh.
But one comment on my part. When I make the introductory slides for these programs, I try to get a map of the United States that has some reflection on the particular topic. I was going to do a thematic map of the United States showing election results, but I decided against that, and I used one of the ones that you submitted. So that's why we didn't have a thematic map in the introduction. Okay. Okay, somebody asked if there's a website, the Washington Map Society. Yes, there definitely is. You can just Google Washington Map Society, and that will get you to the Washington Map Society website. Hey, David Perez, let's say in that James Ackerman image, I guess, you really see how the settler forms of economy and extraction taking place at the Sacred Black Hills head directly to the city center. I guess that's more of a comment.
Oh yeah, you can absolutely use any of these, well, any map, but these maps in particular for all sorts of spatial analyses of history of resource extraction, history of populations growth, all sorts of stuff. Yeah.
Thomas Cock, can we say 18th century mapping was mercantile while 19th century was steam related?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, early 19th century was still marine was still definitely wind driven, and a bit mercantile. So, I mean, it's a problem with defining everything by centuries. There's subtle idiocies around it. But yeah, no, I mean, the 18th century is very much it's mercantile. Most governments are unable to, they don't have the institutional capacity to undertake big projects. Even the Cassini survey of France was actually hived off as a commercial enterprise. Whereas 19th century, it's building up a state capacity. I mean, imagine this. Imagine states as a railway engine. As the century goes on, the railway engines get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they got greater and greater capacity for power, and for work and institutional complexity and all the rest of it. So it's yeah, 19th century, century of steam, absolutely.
Okay, David Perez. I'm wondering if there are Native American scholars contributing to this era, as it was really an era of accelerated dispossession of native homelands in the US.
Absolutely. And again, this is a theme running through volume 5. Unfortunately, is not unique to volume 5. So it's highlighted in this talk. There are a number of scholars, both Anglo and Native scholars, working in more Western and Native scholars working on this issue. From a whole variety of places and aspects. One of the best books by a Western scholar is David Bernstein's How the West Was Drawn, for example, which is all about the mapping and native dispossession and so on in the West. But then against that, you've got people like Margaret Pierce, who has a very large essay in volume 5. Who has worked intensively in the past on this whole process from the native standpoint and the role of native mapping, both in the colonial period, also the 19th century for reservations and in terms of resisting encroachment by non-natives into reservations, which is a long, difficult topic. So yes.
Okay, next question. Do contributors get free copies of the new volume?
I wish, but
I
no.
wish too.
Back when we were on a chapter structure, all the contributors got a free copy. But given the overheads, and I mean, the press actually makes a bit of a small profit, nowhere near their usual profit margin on these books. And that would be just wiped out if you gave every one of the contributors a free copy of the actual book. So what we have is the press, and the press is responsible for all of this, nothing to do with me. I just advise them and comment to them. But when we went to the encyclopedic model, they either give cash or they'll give you the free ebook. Well, they give you the ebook for free. It'll become free after 3 years. So alas, no.
Guillermo Medina, my question is, when you mention colonial cartography, does this include the appearance of ex-colonies America mapping practices?
Yes. I was thinking about this just the other day for some reason. There was a period a few years ago when people were trying to claim America USA had undergone a decolonizing process, which is completely wrong. America, even in the colonial period, the American colonists were very imperialistically minded. I live in New England, where Maine was part of Massachusetts until 1820 because of his aggrandizement of all the stuff down east and towards Newfoundland, for example. So the United States is very much an imperial power, colonial power, as it reaches across the colony or across the continent into the Pacific. I actually just have right here, if you don't know it, Daniel Immerware's book on how to hide an empire, which is all about how the United States is an empire, or he was an empire, so probably still is. We just don't think of it in those terms. But most of the colonial mapping, specifically colonial mapping exercise entries in Volume 5, actually are more about European engagement in the Old World. So British and French, Germans in Africa, in Asia, and so on. So more the kind of imperialism and colonial activity is there's very distinctive in the 19th century, rather than the ongoing territorial expansion in the Americas, which is all under the different countries. Yeah, I think that answers your question.
Bill Green, related to David Perez's question, does Volume 5 discuss 19th century indigenous Native American maps, or does Volume 2, Book 3 constitute the project's final word on that subject?
That's a very good question. No, volume 2, Book 3 is the series statement on indigenous people and their mapping, as opposed to the more because frankly, when Volume 2, Book 3 was done, there really hadn't been much scholarship done on Native indigenous resistance to European colonial activities, imperial activities in the 19th, 20th century, at least not that was substantial enough. And this is the problem, frankly, with the history of cartography. It has been going for so long, because it is so big, it covers such a huge area, that the early volumes, which are really, really influential, have spawned so much new information that they're sort of out of date in some respects. I don't think Volume 2, Book 3 is out of date at this point, but it has definitely spawned a lot more new research that maybe somebody can gather together, not me and not us. I don't have a lock on the concept of a general history. So if someone else wants to do something, please go ahead.
Hey, Amy Worth. By the 19th century, much of the world had been seen by multiple people and had been mapped. However, as an exception were the maps created by William Clark during the Lewis and Clark expedition of land unseen and uncharted in a large way. from a review of first publications resulting from a review of first publication of a resulting map printed by Samuel Lewis from William Clark's original map, geographer John Allen has called the map an item of superlative craftsmanship and analysis. Can you offer your comments on that contribution to 19th century mapping?
Yes and no. No, to the extent that I'm not a Lewis and Clark specialist, but I know the work John Logan Allen in particular. Yeah, that the whole Lewis and Clark expedition is wrapped up in this humongous body of myth between what they did and what has been said that they did. There's a lot of academics who have been very, very serious and very, very close. There's also a lot of popular interpretation that's quite mythic. And one of them is the idea that they went up into this big open unsettled area when they're constantly interacting with a whole variety of indigenous peoples, wintering with them, with the Mandan, for example, and bringing on board a whole bunch of indigenous information about where they were going to go or what was going to lie off to either side. But then the maps that they produced are then absolutely crucial in shaping a lot of the American mentality of the 19th century. It builds up into John Mellish in 1816 is, as a Scots immigrant, is writing in ways that will be very similar to the 1840s and the idea of manifest destiny. And you could argue, I mean, you can even argue that Lewis and Clark were just part of one more element within, a very significant element of a much longer history that goes back, as one of John Allen's later works does. It goes into the whole quest of Europe to get around America, or get through it rapidly so they could get to the Pacific and get to China. And so there's a 18th century idea that there's a river from Lake Superior all the way to the Pacific that's based on a complete misinterpretation of indigenous information from the Cree. And then that then fuels Jefferson's thinking that maybe the Missouri can get you, if not all the way by water, then at least close to the way, maybe with one or two portages. And that leads to Lewis and Clark, which then feeds into everything else. And the whole westward, my great mythical westward course of empire. Yeah. I can't say specifically because it's not about that map and it's that immediate effect, but I mean, John Allen did in his dissertation work. Yeah.
Hey, Ben Olson.
Hey, Ben.
I must ask what some of the internal editorial discussions were concerning the issues of the colonial nature of much of this period of mapping. Does the volume opine on colonialism, resource extraction, etc., or does it remain fairly neutral?
It's fairly neutral. We had a fairly long discussion over the difference between colonial and imperial. Imperial being sort of the more domestic stuff that's sort of promoting the grand imperial schemes rather than particular colonial exploitation. But colonialism in Volume 5 is definitely one of inequality of power, the unequal application of power to extract resources, to extract labor in various ways. We try as a whole, we've never been very strong as in a series of being overtly theoretical, because our authors come from multiple perspectives. We just try to have as many various perspectives as possible without getting too too neutral, shall we say. So one of the things that we've done is to try to make sure that our authors always refer to indigenous peoples by their particular ethnonyms. So rather than talking about, well, mapping by Native Americans, it's, well, okay, well, which mapping by which particular group? Are we talking about Wabanaki up here in Maine? Are we talking about Cree up in the Great Lakes? Who are we talking about? And what's the appropriate name to refer to them? I mean, that's an incredibly fraught topic, because if you talk to any anthropology people who or sociologists and people who work with Native groups, some people like being called Native Americans, some people like being called Indians, some people prefer tribes, some people prefer polities. It's a mess. We're just doing the best as we can in that respect, trying to be sensitive, recognizing political interrelation inequalities, power inequalities when they exist, but we're certainly not being too neutral, shall we say.
Question from Tim Weischool. Colonial mapping of railroads meant the mapping of wood sources because wood was needed for the railroad ties. Can you comment on this kind of alliance between mapping and commodity demand?
Yeah. I mean, the mapping is part and parcel it's part of the infrastructure of knowledge and control to a degree. I mean, mapping is also a social practice, and the ability to make a map, to use maps is a statement of social standing and differentiation between other groups within your own culture and society. But mapping, by certainly in the 19th century and 20th century, is thoroughly normalized in terms of forestry mapping in association with, for example, railroad creation, but also mining, because you need wood props for mine shafts and the like. I often like to think that the only people who actually made money in California from the gold rush, other than the bankers, were the timbermen up in Oregon and Washington, who cut the timber to ship down to the Bay Area for the miners to buy at exorbitant prices to prop up their mines. No maps there though. So yeah, so it's the intercombination of resource mapping, demographic mapping, ethnographic, linguistic mapping, certainly by the end of the 19th century, with economic development, land reforms, whichever way you want to say the land reforms go. So yeah, I hope that makes sense.
I think we'll stop the questions at this point. It's 10 after, and we are losing a fair amount of the audience.
Well,
But
thank you for the people who stuck with it.
okay, but Matthew, I'd like to thank you very much for this presentation. We had excellent attendance, and quite often I give some sort of a cartographic trinket to the speakers as a gift. But I think a better gift for Matthew in terms of this presentation would be for each of us to consider making one final contribution to the History of Cartography project.
At a larger rate than you normally would.
Okay. And if anybody has further questions for Matthew, his email was indicated there in that last slide. And well, again, just the time, the amount of work, the number of people who have been involved, the number of people who have written entries for the entire 6 volumes is monumental. And I think we've really witnessed quite an amazing project here during our lifetime.
It's a biggie. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew, for your presentation and above all for your work on the History of Cartography project. I hope everybody will take to heart your final plea regarding funding, and all the best.
Thank you. Good night, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.
Matthew. Thank you, Ron.
Thank
Bye-bye
you.
all. Have a good
Nice
day.
to see so many nice names, I know.
Thank you, Map Society.